I'm sure participants will join and dial in along the way. Let me just open up my. So yeah, for anyone who's there, please make sure that you mute your audio so the sound won't be circulating. And yeah, and then if you wish to ask a question, there are two ways. You can ask it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and pose your question. So to begin, well, thank you very much for everyone to join. So the introduction of new technology has disrupted and transformed job markets for many, many centuries, and most notably during the Industrial Revolution. And today we are going to be discussing the changing nature of work now. And we have a quick agenda. Fatma, can you go to the next PowerPoint slide?
Actually, you can. You're a presenter, Kai, so you can just go for it. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, excellent. So here we have a quick agenda. And so after the introductions, our three panelists will be giving their remarks, followed by a few of you have provided questions that we can pose to the audience to begin our discussion. And then afterwards, we're going to finish off with some initial reactions to the discussion among the panelists, and we're going to finish with a question and answer period. Okay, so what is this webinar series? So as we kind of prepare for the fourth industrial revolution, the International Training Center of the ILO, the training arm of the labor organization of the UN, is delighted to welcome you all to our 5-week-long Technology at Work dialogue series. And it is an in-depth discussion with leading global experts, and here we have three with us today on how technological change is reshaping our future of work. So the aim of this dialogue series is to broaden the global conversation on how innovation is transforming the nature of work, and also in the context of the future of work discussions. So this dialogue is part of the International Training Center's innovation function, and which is a supportive platform of the International Labor Organization's Future of Work Centenary Initiative. So today with us, we have three panelists, and I'm very pleased to have them. I just want to make sure that Godfrey is able to join. Okay, so we have Godfrey joining us from South Africa this afternoon, and Godfrey Kanyenze is the founding director of Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, and followed by Becky, who is a research officer and the deputy director of Digital and Technology Cluster at IDS. And lastly, we have David Bluestein, professor at the Department of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology at Boston College. And before I give the floor to Godfrey, I just want to make sure that he's able to connect. Okay. Becky, I might need to ask you to begin first, okay? And then while we link Godfrey in. But before we do that, let me kind of set the scene. So a bit of the context now. So decent work is critical to achieving social justice. However, the place and the function of work in society and the economy is fast changing, and hence we also need to redefine what is work and also its place in society, and what are the new social norms, and do we need to reinforce our existing labor policies and institutions, and also how can we reimagine these institutions to make sure that we are able to shape and also create the future of work we want. So one thing that we're also seeing is that we're seeing the erosion of traditional labor employment relations, where in the past we have more of a employer-employee relationship, and then that is fast changing. And what that means, a lot of this traditional archetypal work and work identities are being replaced as well. And then work that is becoming more flexible, short-term, and transient. So work is becoming more mobile, both geographically, digitally, and as well as functionally. And women's participation in the labor market is changing as well. So now we're seeing that on the labor market globally, women's participation is 26% less than that of men, but also they earn about a quarter percent less than men at the global level. And furthermore, there's an overrepresentation of women in the informal market and also unpaid care work. So that can kind of give you guys a bit of the context of where work is at right now. And with that, I would like to first give the floor to Becky Faith, followed by David, then Godfrey. So, Becky? Oh, make sure that you unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So just to introduce myself, as Kai said, I'm Deputy Leader of the Digital and Technology Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. And it's I'm really pleased that I've been invited to join this webinar on what's a really important issue, and Kai's been kind enough to share various of our publications on the Technology at Work blog as well. So that's been a really great arena for us. At the Institute of Development Studies, we're a kind of a development research institute, but we also really focus, as well as having masters and PhD students, we really focus on research in the interest of policy, so informing policy. And for us, the future of work is one of the kind of key defining challenges globally that we're facing at the moment. So I'm going to talk about three particular issues today: the importance of having a global perspective on these issues, which reflects our universalist perspective on development at IDS, the importance of having an intersectional approach, which looks at the impact of these changes in the labour market on marginalised communities, and also looking at the political choices we face and the range of very different responses that we need to develop in response to these challenges. Just to give you a bit of background on what we've been doing, we held a summit earlier this year, a digital development summit on the future of work, and I'm going to share the background paper that we wrote for that in the chat box. So that brought together almost 100 people in London from lots of different backgrounds: academics, policymakers, people from tech companies, and from all over the world, civil society, to talk about this issue of the future of work and the impact of automation. And since then, we've also hosted events at the party political conferences in the UK, and we're now looking to convene researchers from across the different areas of research, IDS, from agriculture to health to young people to sustainable development, to look at the impact of automation on all these different sectors. Because automation doesn't just mean AI coming and transforming the work of doctors or lawyers. Automation also means will have an impact on agriculture, or have an impact on all kinds of different sectors. So it's very important to have this cross-sectoral perspective. So first of all, looking at the impacts on developing countries, a lot of the media coverage that we've been exposed to has been really focused on what's going to happen to white men, really. It's the shorthand for it, of like how many jobs are going to be lost in the Midwest of America, or how many jobs are going to be lost in Europe. And actually, when thinking about the future of work, I think it's really important to take a truly kind of internationalist perspective. The eighth SDG calls for productive employment and decent work for all in 2030, and that means decent work for wherever you are in the world. And so while our research for our events has shown that 47% of jobs in the US are at risk of automation, and possibly as many as 85% of jobs in Ethiopia, and 77% of jobs in China are at risk of automation in the future. And this doesn't also impact on the immediate future. It also means that pathways to development and growth in developing countries, which were relying on the industrial sector for growth, might now not have that choice, because industrial routes are going to be replaced by automation. It's going to be cheaper to have robots making your clothes in Western Europe than it is to be having even poorly paid workers making them in Bangladesh. So as a route to growth, that kind of changes the perspective for developing countries as well. So secondly, it's also, I think, really important to have an intersectional focus, and I've been doing some research on the impact of automation on women, and I'm going to share a link to our paper. So we know that it seems as if women will be more affected by automation, that for every job that more women will at risk of losing their jobs and not getting decent work. Women also typically have much lower levels of digital skills, so that means that the jobs that are available, women that require more sophisticated digital literacy or access to technology, because of women's kind of diminished access to technology and lack of access to digital skills, they're less likely to benefit. It's also the case, if we think about this intersectional focus, to look at not only at the impact of automation on people in the formal sector, but also to look at the informal sector as well. So a lot of the kind of policy choices and the statistics that we read are based on employment in the formal sector. So, for example, the statistics I just cited about Ethiopia. But given that most people in developing countries are employed in the informal sector, then work looks very different. And actually, the issues of precarity and lack of stability that Kai was talking about in his introduction, that's typical of people who work in the informal sector anyway. So it'd be interesting to think about the impacts of people in those communities. But I think it's really important to recognise that we have political choices here. And I think often the dialogue on the future of work is presented as a kind of march of the robots, or kind of human slaves in a kind of robot nation, that we haven't got any kind of political agency in this. And actually, I think the opposite is obviously true, and I think the work of the ILO on this is very important, and it kind of flags exactly what workers can do if they organise, for example. And I think one of the most fruitful things that came out of our research for the Digital Development Summit is bringing together lots of different stakeholders is really vital. So we brought together trade unionists with people from the private sector, we brought together people from civil society with academics, because all these different stakeholders have got a role to play. For example, trade unions need to be, for example, maybe using more 21st century communications tools. If we think about the kind of precarious nature of work, maybe individuals need to be able to take a union with them from sector to sector, so there's some roles for trade unions there. Maybe for technology companies, the onus is on them to be more fair and open. So if we think of, for example, Uber, it was actually banned recently in London, which goes to show that governments can have control over technology companies should they wish to make the right regulatory interventions. So, but it's up to technology companies to be more self-regulating, to be more open with their the way that they're operating in terms of workers' rights. I think civil society needs to be more anticipatory. One of the things that we found is that there really is a serious lack of empirical data on this subject. So a lot of what we're doing now is just speculating rather than actually, despite the kind of great work being done by people like the OECD, really crunching the numbers, there is really a critical need for more informed research about this. So finally, I just think it's really important to get all the different players at the table and to not just think about this issue in terms of what it's going to look like for a certain small community of people in one bit of Western Europe or North America, but just think about this in a global perspective and also think about the opportunities of automation as well. When I was talking about the example of the garment workers, isn't it a good thing that garment workers who work in terrible conditions, terrible working conditions in the garment factories in Bangladesh, is it not a good thing that they might be automated? And I think it's up to society to find different routes to employment that it gives us a chance to think about decent work rather than just providing any kind of work. So that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your remarks, Becky, and also to share your insights and these summaries that came out from the Digital Development Summit. And now I would like to give the floor to David at Boston College.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Becky, I thought your presentation was excellent. I really loved hearing about what you're doing. I hope we can connect. And Kai, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a very important webinar series. So I'm David Bluestein. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. So I've been studying issues around the psychology of working for many decades. And obviously, I have moved into this issue of what does the future hold for us and for our societies. And I concur with Becky that there's a tendency on the part of many people, policy people, academics, people in the private and public sector, to focus on the implications within the Western communities. As I'll talk about, the implications of the world of work are really dire, particularly for people without high levels of skills, and I think we face a lot of challenges in that area. So just to give you a broad overview of what I've been doing, I've tried to kind of infuse a psychological study of working, which is kind of traditional in psychology, and I've been trying to export it into other sectors, in part because I think we absolutely need to know more about what the implications are psychologically for individuals, but not just for individuals, but for communities as the world of work shifts and becomes much more precarious. So in doing this, I've done a lot of research, primarily qualitative research on understanding the nature of work in people's lives, and I'll be talking a little bit about that in my brief remarks here. So the issue of the implications of work for people and communities We actually do know a lot about that, and there's quite a bit of research in the social sciences on what is life like for people who cannot gain access to decent work. We particularly know this from research on unemployment and mental health. And there's been some recent research in this area that has demonstrated, in my view, quite clearly that long-term unemployment, and we're thinking here of 6 months or more, is causally related to mental health problems. And this has actually been demonstrated in a very, very extensive meta-analysis by 2 German scholars, Paul and Moser, published in a Journal of Vocational Behavior in 2009. Synthesizing this research was an enormous project, and it included over 500,000 participants. And what they also found is that the best solution to these mental health problems that people experienced was a return to a decent job. So we do know from research data that if people cannot get access to decent work, they will struggle. And we also know from fairly extensive research that communities will struggle. I've seen this in research here in the US by William Julius Wilson, who wrote an amazing book, albeit it was 21 years ago. It was called When Work Disappears. And he demonstrated also very compellingly that in the city of Chicago, when the factory jobs, industry, when the deindustrialization took place primarily after World War II and into the 60s and 70s, he argued, and again with very compelling research, that loss of these kinds of stable jobs led to greater disintegration, greater alienation, increases in crime, increases in family disintegration. So we actually have some really compelling data on these issues of what happens when work disappears. In my own project that I'm working on, which is a very extensive qualitative study where we interviewed over 60 people in the United States from all walks of life, everyone from homeless people, people on the ragged edge of the working classes and middle classes, as well as people who are in the quote-unquote top 1%. We also have seen from this study some of the depth and the complexity of the kinds of psychological and social needs that working can fulfill. And I'll just summarize those quickly here, that we know that when people do have access to decent work, that they are able to experience a life where they can, in my view, really be alive in the world. And it includes being able to connect to others, being able to self-determine one's future, being able to sustain themselves, being able to have a sustainable livelihood, being able to be the best that they can be. So I've really kind of considered this a kind of way that people have of really engaging deeply in their lives and really being alive in the world in a very profound way. So I think what we're concerned about here is the loss of these kinds of jobs. As I've been delving into this literature and reading things and learning more from conferences I've attended, as well as research that has been done, it's the initial stages of this kind of deindustrialization is already having an impact. It's having an impact, as Becky pointed out, in a lot of developing nations. We're seeing the impact in the Middle East. We're seeing the impact in the global South. We're seeing the impact in some of the industrialized nations of the Northern Hemisphere, where there's been a loss of industrial jobs. There's been a loss of jobs for people who don't have higher levels of skills. There's going to be a gradual creeping up of that as automation becomes much more sophisticated. The interesting piece about this is that it's really hard to predict what's going to happen at this point, and this has been the kind of synthesis that I've reached, this kind of conclusion that I've reached, reading a lot of reports from ILO, OECD, as well as a recent report from the United States from the National Academy of Sciences. And in that report, which was a really excellent report, it's free, downloadable, 2017 report, they concluded that we're at a juncture point, and they believe that this juncture point, I think the similarity is very, very much akin to what we experienced during the global warming crisis, when we realized it 30 or 40 years ago that we had to take action. I think we're at the same point right now. And what the NAS report said is that we are at a junction point, but that we are in more of the driver's seat than we think we are. And I think here's where my ideas very much parallel Becky's ideas. I think that this is going to really argue for much more of an activist intervention policy on the part of our governments, a very strong critique of neoliberal policies, of thinking that the free market is going to solve this problem. In the United States election, it was very interesting that Donald Trump was arguing that the Mexicans and Chinese were taking our jobs. He didn't mention once about robotics taking our jobs, which was very interesting because in many ways that is the big threat, and that would require not blaming things on others, not displacing our anger on others, but making some difficult decisions about things like sharing work, providing much more of a focus of on lifelong learning, and on some of the things that Becky mentioned, for example, not allowing Uber to deliver services in London. Actually making activist interventions is really critical. Another area that's going to need to be worked on, and I actually have been in a conference on this at my own university at Boston College, is what are the implications of these changes at work for education? There's not been a lot of attention to this. What's the narrative we're going to give to our students, kindergarten through high school, about why they should work hard and study hard? The narrative has often been rooted in having a meaningful work life. So some of the future issues we need to look at include studying what are the implications of basic income guarantees. What kind of meaningful, and I mean, I think we're starting to think about disengaging sustainable livelihoods from work. What will those income guarantees look like in a place like the United States, where there has not been a tradition of a coherent safety net? So these are complicated issues. These are issues that I think psychologists, other social scientists could have an important say in. Another point I want to make here, and a closing point, is the impact of the future of work concerns on inequality. A lot of research is coming out for decades, actually, that the use of automation in workplaces having a particularly pernicious impact on inequality, and we're seeing massive leaps of inequality across sectors, across nations, and this again will require the judgment and informed wisdom of the ILO and other multinational organizations, as well as much more of a critical education that we need to provide to voters and citizens in our nations to help them understand the implications of making fast decisions about profits and what the implications are long-term for our societies. So I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, David. So we have been trying to connect our third panelist, Godfrey, and he was able to contact us via email, but so far not on WebEx. So we will continue to work with him and then bring him on board. But for now, yeah, no, David, your intervention was very interesting, connecting the point of mental health, our work identities, and also decent work. So I think, yeah, I think it really goes down to the core of who we are as individuals, and then how we see for meaning through the work that we do. And I guess like some of the interventions, and I have a question for both of the panelists, and afterwards we can go into our two questions that I would like to share with all the participants just to kick off our dialogue, and then feel free to intervene by asking questions in the chat, or by unmuting yourself to join the conversation. So first, yeah, there is a distinction between, you know, how the changing nature of work looks like in the global north, in more industrialized countries, where often this more activist policy might be required by government and also by citizens to say, we do want to be a part of this future work discussion, but in the developing countries, and what are your thoughts on how that might look like for the global south? And I do note that Godfrey is not here right now because his intervention would be key as well. And I also want to share with the participants the 2 questions just to help us with this dialogue. So first, what type of public policies about work should be developed that will support people's psychological attachment to decent work? And with work becoming more fragmented and atomized, how can we promote decent work and economic inclusion in this context of the future work? So with that, I would like to bring this back to Becky first, and then followed by David.
So I have a kind of personal response on these questions that you've got up on the screen, and I think one of the ironies we have in the UK is that people are actually working harder than ever. They're working really, really long hours, and for women that's particularly for women and people with kind of caring responsibilities, that's particularly challenging. So I think promoting flexible working, and actually there's a big campaign in the UK on the 4-day week that everything will be. Oh, in fact, I'm going to share the link because I think it's such a great campaign. One of the things that I don't think we can talk about the future of work without talking about the future of care work, because the work that mostly women do, bringing up children, looking after elderly relatives, profoundly impacts on their ability to kind of find and do decent work, whether it's being able to access either just having flexible working hours, being able to access affordable childcare. So I think the kind of public policies that we need to be talking about are about not only promoting flexible working practices, but protecting women in the workplace. And there's massive kind of political, very high profile debates now about sexual harassment and so on, but actually making workplaces and making the internet as a workplace a safe environment for women, I think is absolutely critical. So there's 2 things there about kind of women's participation. Women's participation in the workforce, so thinking about care work as well and how to balance care responsibilities. And one of the issues I think we face with in terms of developing countries, and I think this is where the role of think tanks and research institutions like IDS comes in, is doing more research on this, that we've actually found this to be a really under-researched area, and looking at these impacts, whether it's on, like I said, whether it's on agriculture or whether it's on all different kinds of work, whether it's on looking at the youth bulge, looking at the education policies that are going to be necessary. So I think one of the most important things is actually finding out more and starting to model more what these impacts will be. There's a question here about civil society organisations, which trade unions have failed to do. I think this. I mean, I used to work for an NGO. I worked for technology-focused human rights NGOs for many years, and I think there's absolutely a role for NGOs and civil society maybe stepping in where there's an absence of union organising or working with trade unions, and being a kind of canary in the coal mine to say, well, what's going on the kind of front line of these issues. I think there's a really, really important for civil society and rights-based organisations, whether that's women's rights or different kinds of organisations. Yeah, so where the question here was about where trade unionists have failed to organise. And actually we've seen some really interesting campaigns in the UK where you've had kind of groups of informal workers, so workers who are kind of cleaning staff and so on, who haven't been so well organised, and actually it's been self-organising civil society that have helped them kind of do some really good campaigns rather than the more formal formal trade union organisations. The trade unions have been slower to catch up. Finally, I think that the UBI, the Universal Basic Income issue that David brought up is really, really interesting. One of the interesting things we're seeing is an enthusiasm both from the right and the left, if you will. So you've got kind of Silicon Valley people getting very excited about it, but then you've also got some really interesting trials in that very large-scale trials in places like Finland, and also a very large-scale trial in India. So I'm very much in favour of it, partly because of this issue about care workers. It means that women's kind of care responsibilities have less of an impact on their working life. So yeah, just to hand over back to Kai and David now.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor back to David, and I think there are two questions questions by Penny on what's your perception regarding the development of intrinsic work values among workers in a post-industrial theory, and then also how can we address what are some practical measures that we can take to reduce inequality? These are big questions, and I think I would like to also open this to Becky as well. Okay.
Can I just ask, what was the first question again? I couldn't quite hear it.
What is your perception regarding the development of intrinsic work values among workers in contemporary era as we move towards a post-industrial theory? And then how might this look like in the global north versus the global south? And then secondly, what are some practical measures we can take to reduce inequalities?
Well, let's see if I could try to combine those two questions. They're obviously huge questions, and I think there's a lot of downsides, obviously, to the infusion of automation into the workplace. There's no question about it. But there are some potential pluses in that some of the more tedious work could be done by robots and automation. However, and I say this with a huge caveat and a lot of apprehension, that the question's going to be, how do we provide sustainability for everyone, and how do we provide for those who want it and who would like to engage in work an opportunity to engage in work, and what will that work look like? I do agree with Becky that the basic income guarantees will be important, and I also think it's a very good point that it will kind of sanction care work, and I think care work is going to be a big part of our solution here, because care work does not go away. We all engage in care work, and it is true it's primarily gendered in most of our societies, although I've done a great deal of it in my life, and a very meaningful part of my life. But I know that it's not common for a lot of men to engage in as much care work, but there's going to be some options for us to kind of economically sanction care work as well. But in terms of the issues around inequality, it's a big worry of mine, because I do feel like automation is going to have an unequal impact in our society, at least at the outset, because the jobs that will be created will be jobs that will require higher level skills that typically the poor or people, the kind of large numbers of workers in impoverished communities, whether they be in the global south or in impoverished communities in the global north, people will struggle because the educational system does not give them the resources. For example, if new software engineering jobs open up to replace truck driver positions, how are we going to train the former truck drivers to be software engineers? And in my world of vocational psychology, where we study how people prepare for their work lives, there are some, not everyone can be a brain surgeon. And it doesn't mean that we can't try to help people get to the highest level that they can get to, but we also need to think about people's values. And this goes back to the first question, people's values and their own intrinsic motivations, and what do people really want to do. This is one of my, as a slight aside, one of my reactions to the Trump election is that as career development people in my field, we offered people retraining, retooling, come work as STEM workers, become data coders, and I think a lot of people wanted to go back to factory jobs. And here's where the education piece is important. With constant retraining and retooling, we're asking people to go back into an institution where they often were not successful. This is a very big issue in the future of work debates. How do we make education much more comfortable and affirming for everyone so that everyone can go back to school and retrain and retool for the future jobs that will exist? And I think that's going to be one of the ways we deal with inequality. I think there are also much broader systemic solutions to the problems of inequality in terms of redistribution of resources and redistribution of financial resources and also social and human capital resources. Obviously, that's going to be a tough road to make that argument, but I think we can do it. I know I had a lot in there, so people feel free to respond.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I think that was a really interesting point about, you were kind of talking about aspiration there, weren't you? Like you're saying that if people just want to go back to the comfort of factory jobs. And I remember there's been some research that's come out recently which said that saying that voting for Trump is kind of areas where people were more likely to vote for Trump were the areas in the US that were more at risk of your jobs being automated. So there's definitely a kind of link between that kind of populist politics, isn't there? But the issue of kind of skills and training, like it's often, we see that a lot, I think we see that a lot in development circles, that people put forward kind of this, all you have to do is just to give people the right digital skills. And you see that even with kids as well, of like, oh, let's just teach all the kids to code, let's just teach or girls to code in this kind of simplistic way, which sort of says, well, then there'll automatically be enough jobs for them. But it's not just about giving people the skills, it's also about the kind of giving people the kind of psychological capacities as well, and giving people kind of the aspirations.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting a little confused with the mute button, but you can hear me now, is that right?
David, we lost you. You've stopped. You're on mute. I think the mute button's confusing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So there is a lot of, I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of flexibility in what people can do, but it's true. There's been such a push to training people to be coders that, think of the kids we knew in school who weren't that good at math. Now, certainly we could help them get to the highest level possible, but there are some, first of all, there's an issue of justice. Why do the wealthy get a chance to choose whatever they want to do and the poor don't? And that's a kind of implicit issue in looking at this future of work dilemma, that in the best of all worlds, it would be best if people could follow their hopes and dreams. And I think that's going to be one of the issues in the public policies about work, because I think the future of work will bring more leisure for many people, and I think but it could also bring in a really bifurcated society. And in a place like the United States, which doesn't have a tradition of a good social safety net, I worry that the guaranteed income will look more like welfare payments. So these are some of the worries I have And I do think the ILO is in a really important position to try to make broader systemic changes in these conversations. And that's why I've really welcomed any opportunity to contribute to the ILO. Are there other questions that, Kai, that we should be looking at?
More. Sorry. Where did it go? What sort of technology is going to be used for that? Like in terms of automation and how do we make sure marginalized groups are being brought into the fold? And then secondly, we have another question on the value that is being promoted are linked to power, and then so how do we change these value systems that repeats the power dynamics in our economic system?
Okay, Becky, do you want to take them or take some of them?
Well, can you repeat the first question, please, Kai?
The first one, if I understood it correctly, is automation is taking away from jobs from different people who are going to be suffering. So what are these tech, and I guess for myself, what are some ways to mitigate them? The risk of automation.
I think these are. I think this is where you can see that this is why this is one of the biggest kind of global challenges we face at the moment. If you have a situation in which kind of short-term economic gain, there's been lots of jobs created. So in a country like the Philippines, where there's been lots of jobs created for call centre workers, and those jobs are going to disappear because the work, it's easier to get a robot to staff a call centre than to train and pay somebody. So this just shows that what you're going to do with the people who've lost their jobs. But I think this shows how these are big kind of political issues. I think it's too easy to just. I think this is where this whole kind of thing of like, oh, you can just train people how to code. I think you do need, as the next person said, you need a kind of change in values, and you need to put this at the centre of the political agenda. And actually, we did see that the Labour Party in the UK, with the Labour Party conference, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, spoke about this as one of the kind of critical political challenges of our era, about the threat of automation, and was talking about the robot tax as one particular solution. And I don't know what people think about a tax on robots as a solution, but I think this just shows that I think one of the things that it behooves us all to do is to put this on the mainstream political agenda, and whether that means we're putting it on the political agenda at national or global level, or putting it on the agenda for civil society, for trade unions, at lots of different levels. And so that's why it's great that the ILO is really taking a lead on this. This isn't just an issue about giving people better digital skills, but I do think automation. I think you've got to see the kind of positive political possibilities. Actually, as I was talking about before, isn't it good that a robot can do the kind of demeaning, dangerous, grueling work of making clothes in a clothes factory? It's actually a chance. This is, as David was saying earlier, it's a kind of once in a generation chance to look at the meaning of work and what meaningful work looks like, and I think also to look at what meaningful work, sustainable work looks like for a kind of sustainable society that doesn't, this idea of a kind of green transition that we might have, jobs might be created in the green economy. I think that's a really interesting area as well. So I think there aren't any easy political solutions, but it's up to all of us to get it onto the political agenda at all levels, really.
Actually, that's a great point. That's a great question. And actually, as you were talking, Becky, I was thinking that maybe that one of the things I would like to propose in a public policy context is that we separate work from the marketplace. That you know, there is this concern that that we've linked work so much to the capitalist marketplace, and what I think will happen is, actually, I think the Jeremy Corbyn idea is an interesting one, but I think it's not a long-term solution. I think a longer-term solution is that we create work and we provide other ways of funding it. For example, I think about Franklin Roosevelt, the great American president, back when we had a great American president, where they created all kinds of work. They created arts work. They created all sorts of different kinds of jobs. I think right now we know that caregiving work, whether it be personal home caregiving work or teaching, counseling, nursing, caring for the elderly, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in our societies that if society could find a way to pay for it, and I think they could, because a lot of our, especially global North societies, are creating an enormous amount of wealth, that we could create work. It will require going back to some of these policies that the right wing finds really abhorrent, but I think that's where we're going to end up. And I think it's actually a very good solution, that we create work in the caregiving sectors, in the artistic creativity sectors. These are things that robots cannot do, and these are things where people want to connect to others. There's an inherent need for us to be in connection. So I do think this is going to be one of the solutions, and it's going to involve unpacking work from the marketplace. You can see I wouldn't win an election for the U.S. president.
But I think that and I think that's one of the interesting political challenges we face now, is that we do need to, someone saying these things does need to be at least on the ticket to be an American president. So I think we need to kind of say the unsayable. We need to be saying, oh, maybe we should all be thinking about working less and more. We need, and exactly what you said about separating out work from the market. I think this is our kind of, I mean, Donald Trump's saying the unsayable. There's an opportunity. I mean, we've seen that in the UK, actually. Someone like Jeremy Corbyn has kind of changed the kind of what they call it, the Overton window, for what you're allowed to talk about in terms of redistributive policy. So I think this is now is a really interesting political opportunity to bring these things into the space of discussion. To say maybe we should all be working less.
Yeah, I agree. That's what the Germans did at the height of the recession, and they had much less unemployment.
Yeah.
I just saw a question up there on valuing people for who they are as opposed to what their work is. This is an area that is very important. In fact, my colleagues and I are doing a workshop tomorrow, actually at the ILO. I'm going to be chiming in electronically on this issue of work identity. We, in the West, in particular the global North, people have often embedded their identities into their work lives, and it's not an entirely productive way to engage in life. I think our identities are much more complex. They include many other domains and contexts. And I think moving forward, it would be good to unpack that, because that will create a lot of tension, and it will also make it harder for people to find meaning in their lives.
Thank you very much. Do you have more that you want to add to that, David?
The issue of identity is a critical one. And I'll just say briefly, I know we're running out of time, but it does vary the degree to which people locate their identities in their work lives. But there's, as psychologists, we've been studying this for decades, and I think that we could do a lot better in our educational systems, helping people to disconnect from that. The downside of it is, again, I wouldn't want to see us do that just for the poor and working class, so they don't become rebellious. That's the other issue I have with the Silicon Valley people supporting the basic income guarantees. because I do think part of their motivation is to try to keep the peace in society.
Thank you very much for both of your remarks, David and Becky. No, I think it is definitely, when we begin to talk about the potential inequalities outcomes of the future work, I think we're beginning to really begin to unpack some of the tensions and also some of the policy discussions that need to happen domestically, but also internationally. And coming out from some of the sessions with the future work team, and one thing that was noted was green jobs and also the care economy will have a tremendous contribution in the future work. And then so that also means repositioning of what is considered valuable, and then how do we reorganize our economic systems, but also our education, welfare, and how we relate to each other and the well-being of of our individuals, our families, and also society. And with that, I would like to close this session. Godfrey did message us that he unfortunately was unable to connect from where he is, so he sent his regards. And I want to take this time to thank both David and Becky who are with us, and thank you to everyone who's online and for your great contributions and comments and questions. Becky, David, do you have any final remarks? And afterwards, we can close this session. Becky?
No final remarks, just to say thank you to you and David and to everybody who's contributed some really, really thought-provoking comments in the chat box as well. It's been really, 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 really interesting. Thank you.
David, you might be unmuted. Just make sure to unmute.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble with this, so I assume you can hear me now, but I want to thank you, Kai. It was a great webinar, and Becky, it was a pleasure to meet you. I hope to connect to you. You're doing very important work, and it was a pleasure. I learned a lot in this session. And thank the participants for their great questions.
And with that, thank you very much to everyone for your participation. And next week, we are going to be discussing the impact of Tech at Work with 3 panelists from Washington, UK, and Berlin. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, and until next time. Ciao.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.